Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Learning to Paint on YouTube, where I am teaching myself to paint using only YouTube videos or YouTube tutorials. In previous episodes of this series, I have used actual tutorials. This time, I'm using a video demonstration from Painting with Kevin, which I used in the last episode as well. However, this one is less a tutorial and more just a quick video of him painting. It's gonna probably differ a lot from his because I don't necessarily have the skills yet that I need to do all of the technique that he does, but I'm gonna give it a try and see what I learn. And you can follow along and see how it turns out. I'm also using a much smaller canvas than he used, and I believe he used oils, and I'll be using acrylics. So it'll be a little bit different as we go through. But my main focus this episode is to focus on the light, the highlights like I did on the last episode if you watched, as well as the kind of overall realism of the scene. So this will be a forest scene, kind of light through the trees and maybe a little brook and some other things. So we'll see how it turns out. Let's go ahead and get started.
We're starting this painting, as you always should, furthest from the viewer. So I'm blocking in some light areas in the left-hand corner and center of the canvas, surrounded by a light grayish blue purple color. And I've laid that in as shadow for the hills that are most distant from the viewer, just blending that into the light space now. And as we come closer to the viewer, I'm now laying in the appearance of kind of the structure of the tree. So this is where you start to see the composition come forward. Notice that it's barely any darker than the shadow behind it, but it brings it forward to the viewer just a little bit. Very lightly, I then am coming in now with a little lighter blue, purplish gray color to give just the appearance of the light kind of shining off these trees. Most of this will be covered up in the final at the end of the painting, but those areas that do shine through or show through will kind of give the appearance that there's multiple layers here and the trees are set out from the background. As I mentioned, by increasing the saturation as we come closer to the viewer, I'm laying in the blocking for this tree that's going to frame the painting on the left-hand side. Just the basic color, the basic layers, just to kind of give the feeling and to help me kind of see where I'm going with this painting, giving just some rough ideas. Now, I actually made a mistake at this point coming too far into the bottom of the painting. You'll notice I come almost a third of the way into the canvas. Part of this is because I was mimicking a tutorial that was done on a rectangle canvas, and I am actually reproducing this on a square canvas. In addition, the original painting was much larger. The canvas was much larger. So I make this mistake coming too far into the canvas at the bottom, but that's a mistake that's easily rectified as we go through this process. Now I'm coming closer again to the viewer, and so on the right-hand side, I'm beginning to bring in the composition and the trees that will appear. Notice again, like we did on the left-hand side, the colors are muted just a little bit darker than they were on the original shadows. This brings them out of the shadows, but not quite to the foreground. It brings them toward the viewer. And here I've added a little bit of a muted brown, greenish brown. It appears almost like watercolor, so it's not very dark, but it begins to draw some of those trunks even out of that background. I fast forward a little bit here and have blocked in some of the basic composition. This is where I really realized that I had come too far into the painting with this tree on the left-hand side. And you'll see at the end of the painting that the left-hand side is actually significantly different than it appears right now. But I realized I could correct that by bringing the stream kind of winding in an S, and the composition actually ended up better for this painting, drawing the eye right into the center of the painting. But here I'm just blocking in the rough terrain for how the bank will appear in the painting and where that's going to be laid out. Now I'm coming in, defining the edge of the bank. This will begin to give the perspective or the layout of where the brook will flow. Drawing in some definition into the land, some kind of raised, elevated spots. And now you really begin to see where the brook is going to flow as it passes through this forest area. On the left-hand side here, I'm just adding some basic highlights, not very bright, but notice what's amazing to me is how quickly and simply, by adding a few highlights, you can create definition and perspective in a painting. Returning to the right-hand side now, drawing the green, by just adding that little bit of color, we're drawing this bank closer and closer out of the background. We draw that to the eye of the viewer. Just blocking in here, I'm just trying to decide where the bank is going to sit and how it's going to kind of round out toward the brook. Here I'm making some definite decisions on the flow, blocking in again the flow of the river, the little creek, and then laying in some shadow there along the ground. But you can definitely see now all of a sudden, just by adding that little bit of dark green, you start to see the bank of the creek emerge from the painting. Now we're back to the left-hand side. To this point, this is the darkest tones I have used outside of this corner in the right-hand side we just did, the darkest tones on the painting. This brings this tree right closest to the viewer. Notice that this is setting this up and reframing kind of the mistake I made with the other tree, bringing it way out into the painting. By placing that tree there, I was making a decision to draw that corner back out and kind of reframe the image a little bit. And by putting the dark color there, it also brings that closest to the viewer and gives the appearance that, hey, we're on this side, the near side of the bank. Once I had that perspective, I was able to then go in to the trees I had laid in earlier and decide which I was going to bring all the way to the front. I decided just to bring one tree here all the way forward, and it appears that it is at the edge of the bank on the opposite side of the creek, adding some additional saturation, some darker browns, and some more detail. I've zoomed in here a little bit so you can see what I'm doing with the highlights. I'm bringing in a very bright green. It's not the brightest green we'll use, but beginning to lay in kind of where I want the light shining through the treetops, through the treetop canopy to lay. And so that helps to define that far bank. And then this is the blocking for where I want the brook to flow. Notice I'm now bringing it to the newly defined left-hand side and covering up some of that mistake I had made earlier. At this point, I didn't know exactly how this was going to turn out or how I was going to make it work. But that's where kind of the creative instinct can take over. I knew, okay, I really like where this bank is lying, so I'm going to give that some darker definition, and the appearance of the bank kind of almost overhanging the creek as it meanders past. And this allowed me to lay in also the kind of the near bank for this tree on the left hand side. Zooming back out now, I took, it's not a pure white, but a white with a little bit of blue mixed in, and started to lay in these waterfalls. Now my fan brush was a little too full of paint, so the furthest waterfall I had just didn't, it wasn't quite right. And now looking back, I wish I had taken the waterfalls actually flowing one to the right and then this one actually going to the left as opposed to the right over the rocks. But it ended up working out. That's one thing I realized that's so important, is to step back from your painting so that you can really see and pay attention to what you're doing and get a perspective, from 6-8 feet away. This was also some experimentation. I had started with the white and I wasn't quite sure how to turn this into realistic water. And you notice that I'm bringing this white in and it ends up not being right because it's almost a muddy brown and it brings the stream kind of too close to the viewer. So what I did was mixed a little blue, which now you see it looks a little bit more realistic. Just adding that little bit of blue tint with the white highlights, and then it gets darker as it goes to the right hand side, and the matching shading on the bank then gives the appearance that we're sitting in the shadows, and as the water goes into the shadows it's less and less visible. Here I'm laying in even brighter highlights for the grass, just the very bare kind of indication that there's this light shining through the treetops into the forest floor. It's amazing though how much a little highlight like that instantly turns on the light, literally, and all of a sudden you see all of these rocks and things take shape along the bank. Just by adding these highlights, the boulders begin to rise out of the waterfalls that are babbling on this brook. One other thing I did with the brook that you can see there now is I added around the waterfalls, I added that rock that sits there on the left hand side right there where I'm painting right now. And by bringing the water kind of over that rock and around that rock, it also helped to make the water appear more realistic and made it look like it kind of wound maybe even back off the canvas a little bit and then back into view. The cool thing is that it actually helps to really draw the eye into the painting along the kind of subtle S curve of this brook. Adding a few highlights now, bringing the white very selectively into this foreground gives the illusion of kind of bubbling water, that it's kind of moving over the rocks as it flows through the forest. Now we're beginning to lay in the furthest layer from the viewer. I'm laying in using the fan brush, the brightest highlights of leaves. This begins to give the trees their shape and allows me to kind of shape them on both sides of the canvas the way that I want them. Again, like the layers underneath, these highlight layers will be mostly covered up, but where they do show through, they provide kind of almost an underlit appearance. Once I decided that this tree here, kind of in the center third of the painting, was going to be the prominent feature on this right hand side of the painting, I had to, number one, bring it forward with kind of the darker brown color, but also now laying in more detail brings it also closer to the viewer because you're able to see more detail. Doing the same with kind of the muted blue colors with the trees in the back gives us that appearance that they're out of the background but not quite to the foreground. So it's an important step. And remember how I said the left-hand side would end up being significantly different than it had started. It started with like a big bunch of trees way out into the center of where now the brook is. But by deciding to bring this, excuse me, this other tree in, I was able to frame it, I think, a lot better composition-wise. Now I'm laying on the next darker level of leaves. Notice I made a big mistake up there. My brush was too full and I splotched big color. We'll fix that in a little bit. But laying in, again, a little bit of a darker color of leaves, now you really start to see this tree take shape and the treetops of this forest begin to take shape and look more realistic just by adding a little leaf. Now brightening that color back up allowed me to soften the blob of paint there at the top. Also allowed me to really shape these trees on the left-hand side. I decided to extend this tree all the way up, bringing it way out into the foreground, again, more near the viewer. And one of the lessons I'm learning about specifically painting trees, when you paint the trees, a lot of times, at least me as a beginner, a lot of my trees, I noticed, if you notice, it's the branch and then, or the trunk, and then the branches are essentially V's that come in at different angles and levels. And so I wanted to figure out a way to make it more realistic. And so you notice I'm painting kind of some broken branches hanging out over the brook here, just to give the appearance that this isn't a perfect tree. It's not just perfect V's, trying to make it look more lifelike by adding now more leaves here with the fan brush. It starts to build in the texture as well as the layers of this painting and gives this painting much more life and much more realism. Now back to the right hand side, we had this empty spot and I wanted to bring these trees toward the viewer, but obviously not all the way to the front of the canvas. I had a mistake here, not really a mistake, but something I didn't like, which was this trunk right here. And so by basically muting it out, it removes that, dropped it into the background again, and gave me what I really like. Actually, I like this texture and this layering. And the final thing to add composition wise are two trees here. I decided to put two trees on the bank, but set back off the bank a little bit. So you'll notice that they're not as detailed or defined as the primary central tree that is the central focus here on the right hand side of the canvas, but they begin to emerge, and I really like how they laid out. But I kind of went crazy, which you'll see in just a minute, adding too much or too dark a detail, and it brought them too far into the foreground. And you'll see kind of how I address that or how I fix that. But this is just kind of laying in the initial trees and how they're going to appear. Now we're adding the structure of the trees, which turns out beautiful. They're beautiful evergreen trees. But you'll notice that as I add this pretty dark color, all of a sudden the trees are popping right out of the background, which is a good thing, except that the composition I had before, where it was kind of between the background and the foreground, was really probably the ideal. So by drawing them so far into the foreground, then it started to make the painting look off balance. In hindsight, probably a solution or a correction of this would have been to add, just to lighten this color, to desaturate it a little bit. But again, I think this is a lesson where here you can really see that, where the tree is like, it's starting to look imbalanced because it looks like it's the exact same position as the tree in front of it, but it is clearly not because it's sitting up further on the hill. And so it just looks kind of like almost two separate paintings. This brown trees on the right side and the live trees on the left side. So, but it's important to step back from your painting to really see, because if I had stepped back, maybe I would have realized, oh, I can desaturate this, or I would have at least had that thought. Instead, what I tried to do, which you'll see here, which was effective to an extent, was bring in the underlying tones, the blue, and kind of not desaturate it, but kind of, I guess, mute it in a little way. And it's working to an extent. You can see the tree doesn't appear to be as distracting to the eye, but it's just not exactly the outcome I had wanted. Now we're finishing with the brightest highlights we're going to use. Notice that on the paint on my brush is almost white green. It's almost a white green. It really brings the brightest spots that I want to highlight, where the sun reaches the brightest spots. And so you have this kind of illusion that the light is shining out of the back, kind of misty background, into the forest where the viewer is sitting by the brook, just kind of watching it flow past.
All right, y'all. Well, this one is done as I'm going to get it. I'm really pleased with how it turned out. Still, there's a long way to go as far as technique, but it was a really great exercise in blending not only colors again, but the shading and getting things to recede into the background. Like, that was really a challenge, as you probably saw. These shadows and these less saturated areas are a little more difficult, but I can tell as I gain more skill, it's going to become easier and easier, and these illusions of distance are going to become easier and easier to create. So this was a fun one. If you'd like to try it, go over to Kevin's channel. It's in the description. You can see this painting, or you can try many of the other paintings he has. He's a great artist, and it's a lot of fun to paint along with him. So hope you enjoyed watching me learn in this episode of Learning to Paint on YouTube.